Tonight we continue a series of interviews with candidates in the city election November 7th. Our guest is the challenger for city councilor in District 9, which covers Allston-Brighton. We'd like to welcome Brandon Bowser.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for being with us, Brandon. By background, you're a teacher, so how did you go from a teacher with some ideas and opinions to a candidate for council here?
Well, yeah, I'm a teacher. I've taught in the district for 5 years, been involved with teachers and staff reaching out to families, and have been very involved with the families of my students. And so I thought that I'm a perfect candidate. Between that and being a member of the arts community, I have the perfect kind of repertoire, in my opinion, to represent our district, and hope to branch young folks, families, and older voters.
Talk a little bit about that, because we didn't cover that before. What have you been doing in the arts community?
So for a couple years, I ran a pop-up gallery that operated out of a cafe, Refuge Cafe in Allston. And I also had the pleasure of doing some events at Pop Allston, which was an incredible experiment that was short-lived, but had a great opportunity. But I worked predominantly with artists from Allston-Brighton, gave them the opportunity to sell their artwork, which is awesome.
Now, of course, one of the other things going on here, and this is kind of uniquely in your district here, is that actually there's only one other district I know of. You're running against an incumbent as opposed to just going after an empty seat. Why change things now?
Well, I think we have a new Boston, and a new Boston is evolving, and I think that we need to look forward rather than back and where we're going, rather than where we've been. Now, going forward, we need to look at where we're coming from, but we need to start looking at new ideas and moving forward. And I think I'm in a good position to branch new young voters with establishment voters and people who have been around for a while that are looking for a change.
Well, talking about change in this district, I guess one place where I expect a lot of change in the near future, it could be jobs, it could also be more housing, Harvard expansion. That's in the Allston area, the Brighton Yards area. What about being able to make that work so that it's not a burden for the neighborhood?
I mean, I was just at the task force meeting a couple of nights ago where they were talking about rolling out new plans and granting contracts for properties around that whole new kind of area. And my biggest concern is this development going to include and be inclusive to people who already live in Allston-Brighton, or is it going to make it harder for people to stay in our district? And I would argue that all development moving forward needs to be inclusive to families, for home ownership opportunities, also for people to pay reasonable rents. And the way we can do that is through mixed income housing. And we need to make sure that when Harvard comes in and keeps building, it's inclusive to our neighborhood and our community that we are now.
Well, one of the things we hear over and over again around the city, and not just in this district, is that we got to have more density to have more units and more affordability. And then you're going to have a lot of neighbors saying, "Wait a minute, not so much here. Where's the parking going to be? Where's the ownership?" What do you do about that?
I think that the beginning of that is involving the community in a meaningful way in the conversation, from the very beginning to the very end. I was at a meeting last night about a project over by the New Balance building on Hutchins Street, and the fact is that it's too dense for that block, that area. They want to put in, I think, around 49 units over there, and we need to talk about density. But I don't think density is right in all locations, right? Because parking has to come with that. People want to drive cars, but in regards to dense projects, I think that it makes sense in some areas, but not all areas. And the traffic and the transportation needs to be able to support that project.
This is Neighborhood Network News, and we're talking with Brandon Bowser, candidate for City Council in District 9. Brandon, this district also has one of the city's struggling district high schools, Brighton High. It hasn't been much improvement lately. You have a high percentage of students from families where English is a second language. What do you think should be done about this?
I think that we need to be working to close the achievement gap in our schools. The fact is, a majority of our schools include many low-income housing students, right? And so we need to work to make sure that we're giving the schools as many services as possible. And when school budgets are cut, the fact is that there's less services available, there's less teachers in the classroom, and there's less support roles. One thing I want to work on doing is bringing more programs and more students from universities to lend a support to some of these struggling schools. Because we have a wealth of resources at BU, BC, and Harvard around our district, and we need to focus on bringing more resources to our schools in the district that are struggling, in particular Brighton High, because they need support with maths and sciences and engineering. And there's no reason that because you are a student from a poor background means that you have to do poorly. And we need to make serious steps to rectify some of these issues.
Of course, another issue here is the terms of the teacher's contract. That the city had a kind of an interim solution to that. In the long run, especially in the watchdog sector here, saying that we got to do something about teachers who don't get assigned and sort of shrink that number down somehow, save money. I mean, what do you think?
I think the leadership of the union is going to really help us out. I don't have the solutions. I'm a lowly teacher. But I think that we need to make sure that we're making sure that highly qualified teachers are in the classroom and to make sure that our union teachers are getting jobs. And typically they might get put on a holding list, but they oftentimes are assigned to a position in the end of that.
Now, finally, this past preliminary election, I know it worked out for you. You got on to the final here, but citywide, the turnout was pretty anemic.
It's bad.
What do you do about it? You're running in a district where, especially Allston, they've had a history of this. So how do you overcome that?
Well, I think that one thing that we did really well is we had a great voter registration drive. The idea is we need to bring more people into the conversation. We had 9% turnout in our district. There was some precincts that put out 32 votes. And we need to give people a reason to vote. We need to make sure that we are accountable to our constituents. And that's one thing I've been working on is going to every meeting I can, talking to every person I can, and make sure that they know that they have a candidate that is there to lead. And I really believe that it's time for a change. I think that there's a new Boston and we need to move forward. And I hope to be that candidate.
I do want to ask you about one other issue that might be on the agenda in the future for the council. There's this growing concern right now in Boston about housing units that are being used for short-term rentals, and some believe this is eating away at the supply for people who need permanent housing. Do you think the council should step in here and try to get a handle on this? I
think this is the exact kind of thing that the council should be stepping in on. We need to make sure that there's housing stock, not just sitting there on Airbnb, but if there's an empty unit, that needs to go to a person who needs a house. I mean, from the one end of the spectrum being homeless to the other end of the person trying to buy a house. We need to be making sure we're making real solutions around housing and not just giving it lip service. We need increased amounts of affordability in these units, and we need to make sure that families can afford to buy a house in Boston.
Another issue you've been talking about is livable streets, because this is a district where there has been some problems, safety problems for people on bikes, along with some innovations for them. What would you like to see in the future?
Well, I think we need to move beyond including foot traffic and bike traffic in the conversation. I think it's a good start, but we need to start looking at real ways to make sure people can get around our city in a safe way. And one of the obvious answers is increased bike lanes, protected bike lanes with that row of cars, and then it has an area for the bikes. But we need to make sure that we're not just saying things. We need to act meaningfully and make sure that we take the focus away from cars and make it more about a mobility-centered conversation, and especially around the element of respect. Because oftentimes cars and bikes get into it, pedestrians and buses get into it, and we need to make sure that we're harvesting an element of respect on the streets, and especially around mobility, because it's not about just driving anymore. It's about how we get to work and how we get to the restaurants and how we get around. It's more than about cars these days. It's about getting on a bus and getting on a bike, and you should be safe in a car or on a bike.
We should finally mention, Brendan, you've got a Facebook page for the campaign, so if people want to check that out, what's the best place to find it?
So it's Vote Bowser D9 is my handle on Twitter and Instagram, but also if you go to Facebook and you search for Brandon Bowser for City Council, I'll pop up, and make sure you remember that I'm on the top of the ballot. So
thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Brandon Bowser, candidate for City Council in District 9.